Hello and welcome, Star People. This is the Outlaw Astrology Podcast. This is the podcast that explores the cosmic connections behind history's most notorious crimes and criminals with a touch of the unexplained and inexplicable. I'm your host, APM, the intrepid star guide and cosmic detective, and this is episode 3 of season 8. Before we dive in, a quick reminder to like, share, subscribe, and leave a review. Give us 5 stars, thank you very much, if you're enjoying the show. And now, let's set our celestial sights on one of the most infamous serial killers in history. A crime that is actually 140 years old. And that is Jack the Ripper. In this episode, we'll be examining the astrological aspects surrounding the Jack the Ripper murders, seeking insights into the cosmic climate of Victorian London, and during this particular reign of terror. We'll explore planetary positions, zodiacal influences, and celestial events that have coincided with these dark, terrifying, and gruesome crimes. Okay, so let's set the stage for Whitechapel. This takes place starting in September of 1888 in London. And to get an idea, it was very smoky and quite dirty and quite dark. Considering that gas lamps would probably have been lighting most of the streets. Lots of horse-drawn carriages, probably not a lot of cars at that point, although Ford was starting to make inroads and would do so in about a decade or so. And how might Saturn, for example, be a carbon restriction? How might that influence societal conditions that will allow these crimes to occur? And what about the Sun's position in Libra, which, by the way, was the position that it was in at the time of the Dear Boss letter, and how the sign's influence could have played into the killer's communication style. So, to keep in mind, this is an unsolved crime and has had many programs, many books, many docuseries, podcasts, and etc. On this topic to discuss the crimes and who might have done it. To this day, the killer's not been unmasked, and this has been almost 140 years ago, as of 1888. So, setting that stage, it was dark, it was dreary, it was depressing. It was not a great time socially, economically in England at that point. There was a great gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The haves had a lot, and the nots had practically nothing. There was coal mines, so that would be heating it. If it wasn't wood burning, it would be coal burning. And so steel mills and coal mines were very much what, besides shipbuilding, would be the work of choice for most people. Women were domestic servants, people of color domestic servants as well, if they could get the job. A job as a domestic servant was considered a step up in the social order, particularly if you were tending to the homes of the very rich and well-to-do. So, if that was not you, you made your way the best way you could. Maybe you had a tea shop, maybe you sold fruit. You had to make it the best way you could. To suggest that it was an easy time is usually by people who write fantasy novels. By the way, I love Stanley and I love Steve Punk, but it doesn't mean that time period was beautiful or wonderful. Some people spent time trying to make money by being resurrectionists. By the way, the medical field and the forensic field were severely not as they were today, so finding clues would have been hella difficult for any police officer, anybody looking for those crimes at that point in time. They had not reached the level they had reached now, so a fingerprint was just a fingerprint to be wiped away. The slums, and there were plenty of them, were dirty, covered in coal dust or steel dust. You either worked one of those 3 things or you worked at a shipyard. It was long, back-breaking work. The wages were not great. And The houses were tightly on top of each other, higgledy-piggledy, and as I said, covered in steel and coal dust. The air would have been very thick with the gaslit lighting, so probably eerily lit and kind of spooky, and the skies would have been filled with smoke because that's how you would have kept yourself warm. There was no internal or central heating or air conditioning at that point, and fans were literally you holding on to the fan to fan yourself as opposed to having an electrical one keeping you cool. So to give you an idea, it was not a fun time, easy time for anyone but the truly wealthy, who actually saw this time as quite nostalgic and wonderful. To give you an idea of Whitechapel was located in East London, and those are kind of the slums, and a lot of high Jewish community and other marginalized peoples had a tendency to live there, so it was not a place where wealthy people tended to live. The people that were set upon were sex workers who had to ply their trade by the cover of night because it was not considered at that point in time to be highly acceptable style of work. Keep in mind that Victorian society was highly repressed and repressive. You literally could not show your ankles. That was seen to be provocative. Nor could you do the same in your sitting room should you have one. All couches, sofas, chairs, etc. had to have skirts upon them because showing even the legs of your settee, your couch, or your chair was considered indecent. People wore corsets that were bound, and that is a health hazard for women. Women wore shoes that were too small for their feet, and that made their feet more misshapen. It was just to stay abreast of a very tight social order that had very specific ideas of how little a woman should be, because you had to wear a corset, whalebone corset usually, because a man wanted to feel as if he could span your waist with both of his hands. So there was very little chance to step out too much. And so, if the above was highly conformist and repressive, then what was below must have been truly terrifying. Which means there were opium dens, there was sex work, there was all sorts of taboo subjects and eighth house, notoriousness going on, because a repressive society like that has got to have a very dark and slightly disturbing underbelly. And so that level of poverty, because a lot of poor people, poverty-stricken people, and sometimes houseless people tended to live in the Whitechapel area at that point. So, let's look at the phases of we're going to look at lunar phases and the timeline, so let's start first with the timeline. So, it starts on the 25th of September. And on that day, I know it well, and the reason why I know it is because that is the date that the Dear Boss letter was written. And by the way, the sun was in Libra at that time. And I am going to also pull up the ephemeris for that time period. And give me a moment, my computer is acting up quite nicely today. I seem to have the poorest of luck when it comes to computers. But on that day, it was the 25th of September, and it's called the Dear Boss letter. And the reason why it's called the Dear Boss letter is because literally the writer addresses whomever as Dear Boss. Doesn't that sound like a wonderfully disturbing Libran way of currying favour and charm? Because that's what it sounds like to me. Now, the Dear Boss letter goes on to mock and cajole and all sorts of groovy, clever things, being very witty, telling the police that they're incompetent, basically, and that they'll never solve the crime, they'll never find them, which, to be fair and clear, they did not, and that this person would prove it. They would commit a crime, and they would take the ears of one of the victims, which is what happened a few days later. So on the 25th, this is the promise. And these crimes had been very much going on a few days before. So the letter is dated the 25th. There are copies of it in, I believe it's the British Museum, if I'm not mistaken. No, Scotland Yard. I mean, New Scotland Yard has copies of this letter still to this day in their archives. And the reason why we know this is because on the 27th of September 1888, that's when the letter arrives at the offices of a newspaper. And the sun clearly did not move too much in that time period. So obviously, it was also a Gemini moon, by the way. And that makes up for the wittiness, the clever, joking. It starts off with, dear boss, I am this type of person. I cannot help myself type of vibe, and moves on to mocking, basically telling them that the police are fools and will never unmask this person, and, basically making it appear as if this person is a genius and that the cops are know-nothing idiots who have no chance of succeeding at this crime, which, to be fair, given the level of forensics at the time, was quite unlikely. So there were a series of 5 murders, and to be fair, these murders were not, this person wasn't taken seriously. And to be clear, we also do not know if the person who wrote the letter actually committed the murders, because the police at that point in time were getting a deluge of similar letters, making similar claims before that letter came and after it came. And by the way, the name Jack the Ripper came from that letter. So if this person was the killer, they absolutely named themselves. So that's how the term Jack the Ripper became a thing, because the killer themselves named themselves, if that makes any sense. So the sun, as I've said, as of the 25th, was in Libra at 2 degrees 8 minutes. The moon is at 20 degrees of Pisces at the writing of the letter. So the letter does not read as clean. It doesn't read very cleanly. It reads as a series of disjointed thoughts. And that is at 20 degrees Pisces, 50 minutes. Mercury, that's the moon. Mercury is at 26 degrees of Libra. So riding along, just in front of the sun. Not riding along with, but in front of the sun. So, dear boss. People-pleasy. Charming. As if to say to someone who is an authority figure, to flatter, to please. Venus at 19 degrees of Leo, and Jupiter at 6 degrees Gemini, not in the sign of its strength, and also retrograde. So you would think this would require a great deal of thought. And given that this person sent a letter, and then the crimes, there suggests a small amount of self-reflection. Now that Venus and Mercury are in a sextile, and that means you have to polish that. You have to work it. It's not going to work itself. That means that Mercury knows how to speak charmingly in an articulate fashion. And Venus wants to call attention to itself. So how do I get attention? And also values. Venus is also values, but how do I get attention in this situation? In a situation in which a ton of other people are making the same claim as me, what do I do to stand out amongst them and above them? Saturn is at 26 degrees of Sagittarius, and it is forming a trine to that Venus. So a tendency to, in my opinion, Saturn is meant to ground. It's meant to be practical. It's meant to make one's worldview and perspective and philosophy, it's meant to ground it in actionable activity. And it's forming a trine to Venus. So finding a way to call attention to yourself and attention to your ideas and attention to your philosophy, because you want attention. This whole person, they wrote a letter to call attention to themselves. They sent it to the press, by the way. And keep in mind also, the Whitechapel area, as I've said, was an impoverished section of England. So this starts it off. The Central News Agency of London received the letter, and it was dated on the 25th, on the 27th. The letter itself eventually was forwarded on the 29th. So that gives you a timeline for which to work with. So the outer planets are probably not going to change that much, but I will share them. Saturn. So at 6 degrees of Cancer, we've got Chiron, which is forming there's a lot of sextiles in this chart is what I'm seeing. So Chiron is in a square with the Sun. So old wounds, nurturing. So whatever challenge is going on with this person's psyche, the person who wrote the letter, that whatever nurturing was happening, it probably wasn't the kind of nurturing that would have led to a healthy individual, because healthy individuals, as a rule, do not kill for pleasure, do not kill for fun, do not kill just to kill, that sort of thing. So this might have some basis in the past. Jupiter is calling the shots on that Saturn, by the way. It is in Gemini. They would be opposing, except Jupiter is further behind Saturn. Saturn seems to have gotten the jump here, but Jupiter in Gemini, very talky, very clever, very witty. The letter was attempting to be clever and witty, but it was a bit disjointed. And so sharing whatever philosophy might have been in it would have been much more difficult. It was written in red ink, by the way, and if you'd like to see it, you can definitely do a search on the internet at 27 degrees alongside of Saturn. So right now we have a Saturn-Uranus conjunction. Uranus is at 27 degrees, 12 minutes of Sagittarius, and Saturn is at 26 degrees, Sagittarius 27. And so that is definitely a pretty tight conjunction. And by the way, Uranus is at 23 degrees 37 north, which means it's also out of bounds. And planet Uranus is disruption. So whatever plans you got, whatever ideas you got, whatever systems and structures you got, it's coming with a new philosophy, new fiery ideas that maybe you don't have it together. Maybe you're not going to catch me because you don't understand. You're not smart enough. You don't have it together. And it's very disruptive, keeping in mind that this is an impoverished section and that some people didn't have a choice. And so sex work is very high risk work. And so these victims were victims of opportunity. They happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and also of a segment of society that's not easily protective and not easily valued or cared for. And so easier to attack and easier to walk away from said attack, because most people are not going to be that upset, but the energy of the time was very much like when other crimes occur. People were terrified. At least people in those sections of town were terrified, because it could mean harm to them. Now, keeping in mind Uranus is in a conjunction with Saturn. And that is about Sagittarian philosophies and worldview and differences. And this is not someone I would see as someone who accepts differences that well, and could probably find a nice narrative about why the differences, why they're doing what they do. What it seemed to me, from what I read in the letter, was that this was being done mostly for pleasure, and for not many other reasons. So that's my first pass of that. So that's that. Now the lunar phase, let's have a look at the moon. So the moon is hanging out, chilling, at 20 degrees of Pisces. And the sun is in Libra. So the moon is further ahead. Now, the moon phase here would be a lot harder for me to do, to be honest with you. But I can do the sign and all that stuff. So let's, Pisces, very dreamy, very not actually in touch with reality, really. Optimistic, idealistic. Most criminals tend to be optimistic, idealistic, and don't seem to have a connection to the past, which they should, and connect those past events to their present behavior and eventually future outcomes. But this crime probably got a miss, not because this person was particularly smart, but simply that forensics and the understanding of the criminal mind was not at its height at that point in time. So that's probably why. If it happened later, we might have told a different story, So that's what I think. That's what I think. That's what I think. So this is what I am trying to look at. September 1888. So on the 25th of September, what I am looking at, the full moon occurred on the 20th of September in 1888. The moon was full. On the 25th, it was a gibbous. So it's a waning gibbous for 2 nights. So from the 25th to 26th, the moon was a waning gibbous. On the 27th, we have a last quarter moon. And then on the 29th, when the lesser was delivered to Scotland Yard, we have a waning crescent moon. Now, what does that say about the crimes? Now, people have a tendency to equate the moon with lunacy. A waning moon is after a full moon, and that basically means that energetically the moon is less clear. So the full moon is clarity and illumination and not just a bit dramatic. And then we have it starting to wane energetically, and so less clarity, less understanding, less illumination, keeping in mind that forensics was very much, and police detection was very much in its infancy at that point in time, and so not very well prepared for these particular crimes, and also the level of brutality for said crimes. So the last quarter moon is on the 27th and the 28th. And last quarter moons are opportunities because they're when the sun and the moon square one another. So at the time, it was moving into a last quarter moon, and that means an opportunity for the moon, for the person to have clarity. So these crimes, it was a lack of clarity and also a lack of reflection and judgment, not simply because people were ignorant or stupid because that's who they were. It's just simply that they were very much behind the criminal at that point. So the letter just arrives on the 25th, and there's only 4 days before it then eventually goes from the newspaper over to Scotland Yard, where, if true investigation can start. So it is a waning crescent moon, and it was in the autumn, which makes perfect sense. I always think darkness, I think these kind of things. And so starting from the full moon on, things take a turn. Once Scotland Yard gets involved, there's more investigation, but it doesn't result in a great deal of clarity. And so, can I say, the moon at that point was in Pisces. Pisces is ruled by Neptune, and at that point, Neptune was in Capricorn at 7 degrees. And it would be in a opposition. It would be in an opposition with Chiron. So Neptune and Chiron are in opposition in this particular chart. Opposition about Chiron of old wounds having to do with proper nurturing. And Neptune at 7 degrees of Capricorn. By the way, Capricorn is about building structures and having a goal and a focus. The goal is to harm people, and the focus is to maintain systems and structures in place, because that's the whole point, to create the illusion that allows this person to evade capture. That's how I would read that. And Pluto is at 10 degrees of Scorpio. So that's some of the things that off the top of my head, that's what I'm seeing in the chart. That's the timeline, and we've got it going all the way from a waxing gibbous, which is a trine type of energy, all the way down to a last quarter moon, which is when the moon and the sun would square one another. So a few days, it would be in, it would go through, it was in Aries at the full moon, and would start proceeding back to, Aries. And so Pisces energy is confusion, idealism, optimism, faith, that kind of thing. So keeping in mind, not just the killer having faith, that the police and people having faith, that the system would find this dastardly person and put them away. And basically, all this dreamy, weird Neptunian energy touching Chiron and some of the other planets made it more likely, and I'm not saying that the star says this, I'm saying that we're talking about evasion and capture. That kind of energy tends to lend itself to evasion and capture, because you have to be able to pin things down in order for that sort of thing to make sense. So, I think that this is a good stopping point for right now, because I have a lot more research to do. But in addition to that, this is going to be a two-parter, because I have a lot more to say on this and not more time in this episode to say it. So there will be a second part of this for episode 4, in which we're going to talk more about the Jack the Ripper murders and what the stars have to say about that. So, with that, today we're just going to conclude, for now, our astrological journey through the Jack the Ripper case, and we're going to be, we're left with more questions and answers technically, much like in the original investigation. So we've looked at so far the climate of 1888 London and how it may have set the stage for the crimes, but I would like to go deeper. So the key takeaway today is that the stars do not dictate the actions, they eliminate the energies at play during pivotal points in history. So, for homework, I encourage you to research a astrological chart for London on September 25th through the 30th, because I believe the last crime is done on the 30th, which is what we're working toward. We're moving toward that particular that timeline. So, the next episode will continue the Jack the Ripper timeline as I currently understand it, and then we will color in some details. So, there is going to be a double event on the 30th of September 1888 that I will cover in the next episode. So, you're going to ask yourself what you can glean from this cosmic snapshot, because once again, we're not glorifying the darkness, we're using the darkness to better understand the world and our place in it. And this has been APM, your intrepid star guide and cosmic detective, reminding you that even in the darkest of nights, that stars still shine. Until next time, keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the skies.